Hello and welcome to another episode of the Music Rabbit Hole. I'm your humble host and music bus driver on today's musical journey. Kind of a different episode on this channel, and I'll probably start doing more and more of these non-formulaic episodes. I know the basis of this channel entirely was I'm going to find, I'm going to start with a band or artist. I'm going to find 9 other somewhat similar bands or artists along the way that you may also enjoy. There's hundreds, I think, of episodes of that show, so plenty for you to watch in that. But as the channel has kind of grown and as I've grown and my interests, go here and there, I wanted to do different content here on the channel. So this is one of those examples as far as something that's a little different than some of my other videos. And the thing I wanted to talk about on this episode today is the 2004 music documentary Metallica, Some Kind of Monster. And maybe if this goes well, and I'm kind of doing this on the fly, this isn't, there's no script here or big format. I'm just going to kind of go with it and see what happens. But I think if there are other music documentaries that I have not had a chance to see yet, and I start to see them and I want to talk about them, then I'll probably make more videos with that. So whether you're listening to this in podcast form or you're watching the YouTube version, this video is going to be about this documentary. And it's not going to be a full necessarily breakdown of the entire documentary. I encourage you to check it out yourself. I found it on Amazon. There's, I'm sure, other places you can get it as well. But basically, if you haven't seen it, and by the way, I'm not a giant Metallica fan. Not that I don't respect them or anything like that. They obviously are huge and have created incredible music, and they've got some songs that have influenced the genre and things like that. So this is not anything against Metallica. They're just not really my thing. I'm a softie. I like lighter stuff a lot of the time. But I went into this movie with no kind of background knowledge of this specific time that the movie's about. I just like music documentaries. So I was like, I haven't seen this. This tends to be on the list of like some of the best music documentaries of all time. So I'm going to watch this. So if you haven't seen it, it's a 2004 documentary about Metallica, of course, and it is covering this period of 2 or 3 years where the band themselves are going through just a big transformation. And this is a band that obviously was huge in the 90s and things like that. And so where they currently sit, they're obviously a little bit older. Their lives are changing a little bit. Their attitudes are changing a little bit. And as a band, they're going through some big changes. I mean, from musically and members-wise, Jason Newsted, who was their bassist, leaves, or they kind of push him out a little bit. I think he had a side project, and James Hetfield, the lead singer for Metallica, didn't really want Jason to do the side project, and so he kind of he gets pushed out. And so the band is going through this situation where their bassist has left now. They are trying to produce this new album. They're dealing with the fallout of Napster, their lawsuit against Napster in the early 2000s, where Metallica, and especially Lars, their drummer, was super outspoken against this idea of music sharing illegally, especially with bands and artists not receiving compensation for these illegal streams. And as somebody who grew up in the early 90s and definitely, was around in this Napster era and the LimeWire era and Pirate Bay and all these things, it was crazy at the time. I mean, you could literally, I remember I did this. I'm not proud to say it. And are we past the statute of limitations? I don't know. I remember downloading like Jay-Z's entire discography off of Pirate Bay or something like that for free. And putting it all in my iTunes and then moving that all to my iPod at the time and just having all this music at my fingertips. And look, I was a kid, so I didn't necessarily think about the fact that like, hey, Jay-Z's not getting a dime of this. And I think there's plenty of discussions around platforms like Spotify and places like that, maybe not providing fair compensation for smaller artists and how hard it is to make any money through these streaming platforms. That's a whole bigger video and bigger conversation for sure. But at the time, basically, it's a file sharing service, Napster. I'm sure you've heard about it. And Metallica was suing Napster. And Lars Ulrich was a big face of the lawsuit. And a lot of the fans didn't love Metallica being involved in this lawsuit. And so there was some backlash there. And so bassist leaves, fan backlash with Napster, the butting heads of Ulrich and James Hetfield is evident. And they're also trying to make this new album. And so the documentary is following this turbulent time of this group. And I think from my understanding, and again, Metallica fans probably know this better than I do, because if they're students of the band and they know so much about them, they're going to know more than me. But it is my understanding that at the time, especially in this like heavy metal type genre, there were no documentaries and documentation and this behind the scenes really of groups like this where it humanized the individuals as much as this documentary does. For example, one of the biggest examples in the movie is you see James Hetfield attend his daughter's ballet class. And Hetfield is the frontman of arguably one of the greatest, heavy metal bands of all time, heavy rock, heavy metal bands of all time. And he's in looks like just a normal dad at his daughter's ballet recital or class or whatever it was. And so it is my understanding that there were, when this documentary came out and it really did show the human side of some of these guys, it kind of destroyed that mystique that surrounded this pre-Twitter, pre-Instagram type era where we didn't have the access to these artists besides maybe, the occasional interview or late night appearance or things like that. And so, what this documentary did is it really shows you the nitty gritty of the daily lives of these guys, to the point that there are points in this documentary that are arguably a little boring. I mean, there's conversations that happen that don't necessarily move the plot too much or are more about just the daily minutia of life. And I think at the time, it seems like, especially for this genre, that this just didn't exist. We weren't getting this insight on these rock gods as much as we did with this, where we're seeing them eat yogurt. We're seeing them argue about trivial things. We're seeing them, bitch and moan about things that you're like, oh man, you just sound kind of whiny right now. And for a lot of the movie, and that's one of the big complaints on some of the, when you go to Rotten Tomatoes and you read some of the reviews and you look at YouTube comments and things like that, a lot of the complaints tend to be, man, these rock stars are so whiny and they're babies. But that's, to me, one of the most interesting things about this documentary is the fact that, yeah, artists are whiny babies a lot of the time. Even the guys that are as hard as Hetfield and Ulrich and so, these guys are kings of a genre, but at the end of the day, they can be babies sometimes. They can be whiny sometimes. I mean, they could be divas. I mean, obviously. And they're no different than maybe the pop singers out there that occasionally, Mariah Carey is an example, and I don't want her fans to go after me or anything, but, there are artists that are, pop artists in any genre that are looked at as divas, and clearly Metallica is no different. So there's that component that was really intriguing throughout. For the music fans, there's the nitty-gritty behind the scenes of like songwriting and song building that I really enjoyed, as far as kind of just seeing guys scribbling lyrics in a notebook. That's, for a music fan, like that's the best. Like seeing the process, seeing the here's this line, no, that word doesn't sound good. They're workshopping things, and that was fairly new for this band at the time. Is they actually getting everybody's input on songs, when in the past it seems like guys like Kirk Hammett wasn't really. He wasn't really necessarily involved in the lyric writing process. It was like, all right, James has the lyrics and he and Lars put something together, or, et cetera. And so getting the different inputs and things like that, that's a really interesting component to this documentary. But I really, to me, why this movie has stayed with me so much over these, past couple weeks since I've seen it is the therapy sessions with the group. So if you don't know, they bring in this performance enhancement coach named Phil Towle, who is a therapist. He's worked with some big acts, he's worked with some big artists, and he comes in, and the whole idea is basically to have these group therapy sessions. And I feel like in early 2000, especially for men, therapy just wasn't much of a thing. I mean, you could look at a show like The Sopranos, and you see an example of, here's this mafia boss, and I know that's a fictional show, but here's this mafia boss who has panic attacks, and he is seeing benefit from therapy and working psychiatrists and things like that, and but it's not talked about. It would be the worst thing ever if the rest of his group found out. And I feel like for a movie that was made in 2004, and the filming happening a few years before that, to see these guys sit in the room, share their feelings, recognize their feelings, discuss it. There's a scene where Lars is in James Hetfield's face screaming the F word at him. That is something that we just didn't have access to at that time, and I think it was extremely rare for quite a while to see that type of benefit to therapy. And you could argue, I think, and Metallica fans, I'm sure, feel strongly about this, you could argue that Phil Towle, and you can see in the documentary, maybe overstepped his bounds at times, or some folks even the band at times accused him of thinking he was part of Metallica. Like he's writing. There was some scene in the movie where he writes a note on a sticky note and he hands it to Hetfield. And it was almost like maybe that was like a lyric suggestion or a song suggestion or something along those lines. And so there's moments where you're like, okay, did Phil overstep his bounds? Is he around the band too much? Is he becoming compromised by thinking like, he's cool and he's part of the group? That's definitely I think a worthy argument to have. But I think what you can respect is I think Phil does a tremendous job at times getting these guys to recognize their faults and recognize their relationships with each other. These are men that have been together for quite a while, especially these three at the time. And I just think that it was just so interesting to see these guys who are the creators of some of the biggest heavy rock songs on the planet share their feelings with each other and talk in a way where they're like, they're giving these therapist type answers to each other, things like, I recognize like maybe I'm being a little hostile towards you, or I understand what I did was wrong there. And they're like having this self-recognition moments. And again, these are the guys that are singing in front of 40,000 people, playing these crazy hard riffs and just going nuts. And that's refreshing. It's just, my point is that was really refreshing to see. Regardless of what you think about the actual album that this movie produced, Saint Anger, I did go back and listen to it, and it's probably not one of the better Metallica albums out there, that's for sure. There are some moments in the documentary where, when they're approaching things from a lyric perspective, while as interesting as that can be, I was cringing a little bit at some of the ideas and suggestions that they had, where it was kind of like, really, that's the lyric you're going with? But overall, an insight into the process, an insight into Jason Newsted, who was trying to better himself. He goes to rehab in the middle of the documentary and comes back, and he's clearly going through his own turmoil of my interpretation was an aging rock star. Kind of seeing like, all right, well, the parting ways of my youth are slowly shrinking. I have a family now that I need to support. But I also need to continue creating this art because it's a part of me. It's the only thing I know how to do. And so, he's dealing with that and dealing with these different egos and with his bandmates. And Lars Ulrich is no saint. I mean, he's definitely got some issues too. And so, seeing all these various interactions with each other and seeing these transformations, and then all of it culminating with Rob Trujillo being added to the band, which was super awesome. There's the scene of him auditioning with Metallica and being brought into the band. And my understanding is he is one of the nicest guys ever, it seems like. And same with Hammett. I mean, Hammett really, and even in the documentary, he kind of is this lighter force in the room with when Lars Ulrich and Hetfield are constantly butting heads. You do have Hammett being kind of the laid back kind of voice of reason, trying to get everybody to be friends. I mean, that's the really interesting component as well. But yeah, I think there were multiple times doing this documentary that maybe the band was gonna stop it, and they were like, we don't want to do it anymore, or maybe they were worried about how much coverage is too much. I mean, the cameras were with them constantly, especially at one of the most trying times in their lives, and that's what makes this documentary, to me, one of the best I've ever seen, is the fact that the cameras were let in during this insane time for one of the most successful heavy metal bands of all time, but really just showing that these guys are real people and they have conflicts just like you do with your friends at work, or your maybe even not friends at work, just your coworkers and colleagues and your family, and conflict is just such a real thing. And dealing with that conflict, especially with people you've been around a long time, it doesn't escape anybody. And we obviously hear about bands having rifts and fights, and they go on hiatus and things like that. And Metallica clearly was no different, but they were able to get past that and become who they are today, which is crazy. I mean, they're still around. They're still making music. They came out with that new album not long ago, and now have been officially active as a band for 40 plus years, 1981 to now in 2023. So yeah, I mean, shout out to them for sure. And shout out to this documentary, Some Kind of Monster. I highly recommend it. It came out, almost 20 years ago. Next year will be its 20-year anniversary. And if you're not a Metallica fan like myself, again, I don't listen to all their albums or anything like that. I know the main hits, but I'm not pretending that I dove deep. I would recommend you, if you're just into documentaries, and especially music documentaries, Some Kind of Monster. It's about a little over 2 hours, and you can get it on Amazon, etc., and things like that. Highly recommend to check it out. That's my thoughts. That's my review. If I was going to put a number on it, probably 8.5 out of 10. I mean, honestly, probably an 8.5 out of 10. I think my only knocks against it is, yes, I think there's some footage that's a little not doesn't move the story along, isn't really that interesting. I think that's really my main gripe, is I think they could have trimmed this a bit, maybe get it around 2 hours, and I think they would have been okay. I think another complaint that some people have is they don't necessarily dive too much into the history of the band. They barely touch the surface, so I didn't necessarily come away knowing a ton about the back 20 years of the band. You just kind of really know a lot about that 3-4 year period of the movie itself. But those are my thoughts. This has been a special episode of the Music Rabbit Hole. Some Kind of Monster, Metallica, 8.5 out of 10 for me. I'll see you next video.